Peace be with you. My name is Allan Keislar. Welcome to the Institute of All Intelligent Life. We are continuing our class on extraterrestrial spirituality. Eventually we will be talking more specifically about spirituality, but right now we are going through Dr. Michael Salla's very important book, Exposing U.S. Government Policies on Extraterrestrial Life. The United States government has been in communication with many different groups of extraterrestrials, at least since 1954, and in this book we have been reading about that. So we're going to continue today talking about sightings of extraterrestrials at classified facilities or operations. It may be astonishing to many people, just the news that extraterrestrials exist and have been visiting Earth for a long time, but to learn that there have been many sightings and many witnesses of those meetings, even with extraterrestrials, and even, as we will conclude, sometimes there have been fights between American military or security officials and extraterrestrials. So this is quite an astonishing topic, but we will continue after a brief meditation. Let us all pray for success in this very difficult endeavor to understand and share with others the truth about extraterrestrials visiting our planet, and even governments making agreements with them and working together with them in secret facilities. So we have talked earlier about President Eisenhower's meeting with extraterrestrials, and then official agreements that were made between the United States government and extraterrestrials. And today we're going to continue with some more information about many witnesses who have testified, often military witnesses, who have testified to actually seeing, meeting, talking with even extraterrestrials, and even fighting with them. So in Dr. Salla's book, secret agreements that have been made between the United States government and extraterrestrials has been discussed. And now I'm going to start with Charles Hall again, who we had mentioned earlier in this class, who had met with extraterrestrials and became friends with a group called the Tall Whites in the Nellis Air Force Base facility in Nevada, at Indian Springs facility there. So there was an interview that Michael Salla had with Charles Hall, in which he asked him about the facility, the hangar that was used as a base for the extraterrestrial craft used by the extraterrestrial group called the Tall Whites. And Charles Hall said the hangar appeared to have been entirely constructed by the United States Air Force for use by the Tall Whites. So it looked just like hangars that had been built in the 1950s or 1960s during that period of time. But it also had signs not only in English but also in some hieroglyphics, which was the language used by the aliens, by the Tall Whites. And so here's one testimony of a military man, Charles Hall, who met with extraterrestrials. Clifford Stone is another retired staff sergeant in the U.S. Army who claims to have secretly worked for 22 years in classified projects aimed at the retrieval of crashed extraterrestrial vehicles, not only in Roswell in 1947, but on many other occasions. The United States government recovered extraterrestrial craft which had crashed and Clifford Stone was one of the officers in that effort. And so he talks about how he was introduced at the beginning of his career. He was introduced to an extraterrestrial who was, he said, a little bigger than the 3 or 3.5 foot tall entities that had been reported often. But he said when he saw this extraterrestrial, that creature looked at him. He wasn't a human being, although he was, 2 arms, 2 legs, like a human being. But he said, it's like you are seeing it, but everything is being pulled from your mind. He was reading my whole life. As he looked at this extraterrestrial into his eyes, the extraterrestrial seemed to be able to read his mind. And Clifford Stone said that he fell to the ground. He was feeling so overwhelmed by this sensation that the extraterrestrial was probing his mind and was seeing his whole life. So this was another witness that extraterrestrials are working with the United States government, Pentagon officials, and in classified programs, and group of National Security Agency officers. A third witness is Captain Bill Uhouse, a former U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Air Force, and aerospace engineer. And he is a whistleblower, confirmed. And he talks about meetings with an alien who they called J-Rod. This alien used to come in with Dr. Edward Teller, the famous scientist, Dr. Edward Teller. And sometimes the scientists would have questions they couldn't figure out about some of the technology, and the extraterrestrial, J-Rod, would explain to them. He would talk with them. And he said, Bill Uhouse said that it was a little strange because he would talk, but it sounded like as if you spoke. It was sort of a telepathic communication. So, is it believable? But this is what all these witnesses, military witnesses and engineers, are stating, that the United States government is, in fact, working with extraterrestrials. Another witness is Richard Doty, who was a former special agent for the U.S. Air Force, Office of Special Investigations. And he was actually tasked with the job of discrediting some UFO researchers who had found evidence about the presence of UFOs. But he also then later came out as a whistleblower and described an interview that an alien had with an Air Force colonel, and it was actually videotaped. And he said this ET was here, this extraterrestrial was here from 1964 until 1984. And we learned from him a great deal of information about their race, culture, and spacecraft. And he says, Richard Doty says, a third alien was also part of the same exchange program from 1979 until 1989. So they are guests of the U.S. government and reside in a number of different quarters around the U.S. So in other words, some sort of exchange agreement exists between the U.S. government and extraterrestrial visitors. And Dr. Salla points out that in Steven Spielberg's movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, this was actually described. There are many so-called science fiction movies and books that appear to be science fiction. That's the way they're presented, but actually they're true. And Richard Doty also confirmed that Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, met with Steven Spielberg when this movie was released in June of 1982. and said to Spielberg, "You know, there aren't 6 people in this room who know how true this really is." In other words, this is not science fiction. Many of these science fiction movies are actually based on fact, or they are actually not science fiction, they're science fact. And actually, I've mentioned before that I met with Arthur C. Clarke, probably the most famous science fiction writer of the 20th century. I met him in 1985 at his bungalow in Sri Lanka, Colombo. And he also said that he knew extraterrestrials, and he indicated that his books, science fiction books, were actually real. They were actually based on scientific facts. So Steven Spielberg's movies, too, are often based on true ideas. They're presented as science fiction. Another witness is Steve Wilson, who claims to have risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force before retiring. And he was also on a highly classified crash retrieval team. They were retrieving extraterrestrial vehicles. And he died in 1997, shortly after going public with his remarkable claims. But he said, it's getting more and more interesting, an 8-foot tall extraterrestrial woman briefed a group of about 20 officers and civilians in the history of Earth and other planets. And I'm going to read what Dr. Salla has quoted Steve Wilson as saying. The woman had finely chiseled features. Her blonde hair cascaded neatly past her shoulders. Her eyes were the bluest blue I'd ever seen. Somehow she was different. Little did I know then how different. She had a large crystal on the table, and without warning, her fingers began to glow as she ran them over this crystal. A 3D hologram began to form above it. I looked around the room, and everyone's mouth was hanging open, and suddenly I noticed mine was too. Little did I realize that at that moment my life would be forever changed. My past teaching slipped from me as I stared. My whole concept of life did a 180-degree turn as I watched the hologram, complete with sound, unfold the mysteries of the past and present, and of other worlds. So we've seen, probably you've seen in science fiction movies, this sort of, where somebody just slides their hand across maybe a crystal or something, and a whole hologram emerges and plays. That's not science fiction. This is fact. Those movies are based on this sort of experience where an 8-foot tall extraterrestrial blonde woman with blue eyes was telling a group of 20 United States officers and civilians working with the military on these projects about the history of the Earth and the history of other planets. So, it's going on. Another witness is Dan Burish, who claimed he worked with a sick extraterrestrial who was called J-Rod at the highly secretive S4 facility near Area 51. So this extraterrestrial was ill and was having some sort of neural degeneration. His nervous system was not in good health. And Burish says that he was given the job of entering into this extraterrestrial's container where he was being kept. And he put on something like an astronaut's spacesuit so that he could go in there with him without perhaps becoming contaminated. And he said the J-Rod essentially performed a mind meld with him, in which in this case the extraterrestrial downloaded a whole lot of information into Burish's mind. And so it's incredible. I'll read a little bit about what Dan Burish said also. He says, I actually came into direct contact with him, the extraterrestrial they called the J-Rod, at the end of 1993, the start of 94. There is something wrong with him. During the entirety of my experience around him, he appeared at the best that I can describe is off-shifted, almost like, he was physical. I felt him through the glove, because he was wearing a suit with a glove, but he actually had to hold him. I felt him through the glove. There was matter there with me, but almost like he was a ghost with a body. He did not belong where he was. Yet when he would communicate, when he would do the entrainment, that is the brain transfer of information from his brain to Dan Burrish's brain, when he would do the entrainment, they thump you and until they finally come into contact with the brain level waves where they can begin communicating. And it comes in waves. And then you feel yourself pulled in. As the entrainment is occurring, the perception is being pulled into his eyes. Very unwieldy feeling, Burrish said, laughing, chuckling. But then they entrain you, bring you down to, relaxed almost to a theta state, like an 8 hertz thing, theta state, where you're very almost like drowsy, and they tell you, they're not going to hurt you. He did that. He actually said that he would not harm me. I was part of a B unit team to start with. In fact, that was going to be my actual occupation in there, was assisting the chief scientist and going into the clean sphere until he identified me as somebody, I guess, special to him. Chiela, that's the name that Burrish called him, the J-Rod. He wanted me to be the person to go in there. And that's why I was promoted ultimately to the working group later in there. So as we saw in the case of Charles Hall, the tall whites chose him for some reason, and he was their communication person. So in the same way, this J-Rod, this extraterrestrial, chose Dan Burrish as the person that he wanted to be working directly with. So he was in this, he was kept, this J-Rod was ill, so Burrish would actually go in and touch him and hold him, and evidently was helping him. They were helping each other in some way, in their own ways. So this is interesting because here we have a unique testimony that an extraterrestrial was actually sick and how he was treated in classified facilities by medical scientists. We'll do a couple more of these testimonies. Mark McClelland is another person. He served as a contractor to NASA on numerous missions, including Mercury, Apollo, Skylab, Space Shuttle, the International Space Station. And he worked as a spacecraft operator. And his work has been documented, and he announced that he actually saw an extraterrestrial communicating with astronauts in the space shuttle. So this was an ET who was 8 or 9 feet tall. And while McClelland was working in the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, or Cape Kennedy, he said this ET was standing upright in the space shuttle payload bay having a discussion with 2 tethered U.S. NASA astronauts. So he actually witnessed this on the monitors while he was working there in NASA. He said, I also observed on my monitors the spacecraft of the ET as it was in a stabilized, safe orbit to the rear of the space shuttle main engine pods. I observed this incident for about 1 minute and 7 seconds. Plenty of time to memorize all that I was observing. It was an ET and an alien starship. A friend of mine later contacted me and said that this person had also observed an 8 to 9 foot tall ET inside the space shuttle crew compartment. So, top secret missions, but persons who actually witnessed them are coming out and testifying. So, I think to conclude, we will just talk about the firefight, an actual fight between extraterrestrials and U.S. elite military forces. This one occurred in 1975, at Groom Lake in Nevada. And this is in Dr. Michael Wolf's book, Catchers of Heaven. And this is what he writes. The Greys shared certain of their technological advances with military intelligence scientists, apparently often while prisoner guests within secure underground military installations in Nevada and New Mexico. The extraterrestrials have given the U.S. government some of their anti-gravity craft and a huge amount of fuel, element 115. On May 1st, 1975, during one such technology exchange in Nevada, a demonstration of a small ET antimatter reactor, the lead Gray asked the colonel in charge of the Delta forces guarding the ETs to remove all of their rifles and bullets from the room so that they would not accidentally discharge during the energy emissions. The guards refused, and in the ensuing commotion, a guard opened fire on the Greys. One alien, 2 scientists, and 41 military personnel were killed. One guard was left alive to attest that the ETs apparently used directed mental energy in self-defense to kill the other attacking Delta forces. Dr. Wolf states that this incident ended certain exchanges with the Greys. So even this could happen and did happen. And Bob Lazar, who we've mentioned earlier, or in earlier classes a few weeks ago, he also tells about reading about these incidents where there was a clash between extraterrestrials and military personnel. He reports this happened in 1979. And this, of course, Lazar did not personally observe this firefight, but he read about it in his briefing documents when he was brought into these secret programs of, he was actually doing reverse engineering of extraterrestrial craft. And finally, we'll talk again about Phil Schneider, who we had mentioned a couple of weeks ago. He claims that he was directly involved in a firefight with extraterrestrials in 1979 at the Dulce classified facility in New Mexico. And this is what Schneider writes. Back in 1979, the firefight at Dulce occurred quite by accident. I was involved in building an addition to the deep underground military base at Dulce, which is probably the deepest base. It goes down 7 levels and over 2.5 miles deep. At that particular time, we had drilled 4 distinct holes in the desert, and we were going to link them together and blow out large sections at a time. My job was to go down the holes and check the rock samples and recommend the explosive to deal with the particular rock. As I was headed down there, we found ourselves amidst a large cavern that was full of outer space aliens, otherwise known as large Greys. I shot 2 of them. At that time, there were 30 people down there. About 40 more came down after this started, and all of them got killed. We had surprised a whole underground base of existing aliens. So Schneider did not even know what was going on. He was just working as a civil engineer, working for the military, building this underground base, when by mistake or without realizing what was happening, they drilled into an underground alien base. So this was a joint base between humans, American military, and these extraterrestrials. So Schneider, unfortunately, was killed, or he died under very mysterious circumstances shortly after he came out publicly and revealing all this confidential information that he had observed. And he himself was injured in that firefight, but I think everybody else was killed. Maybe there were at most 1 or 2 others survived of the American people that were involved in that firefight with aliens. And he then came out publicly, gave a number of spoke at a number of conferences, and he knew, in fact, he knew that he was going to be killed because he had come out and broken these confidential information out to the public. But he felt he had to do it. He felt it was so important. And he did, in fact, die, or he was killed shortly after he had come out publicly. So, this is quite astonishing information, but it's true. I have no doubt at all. And we need to become aware of this. This is what's going on. So, I will just turn to see if there are any questions or comments. Manjit Singh Katuria, today's need of the world. I believe, Sat Sri Akal, Sardarji, I believe you're saying that today's need of the world is that we understand about extraterrestrials. If that's what you mean, I agree with you 100%. Very, very important. It's a great need of the world to understand what's really happening with extraterrestrials, because there's so much highly advanced technology which we have. The secret military and intelligence factions within the American government and other countries also, they have this technology, time travel, teleportation. And when this technology is released to the public, it will cause a revolution in medical technology. There are facilities that the extraterrestrials have actually built in which human beings can go, and most of the diseases we have can be cured very easily. All of the problems we have of pollution because of using oil-based cars and airplanes, that will become obsolete, and we will be able to be transported using either teleportation or transportation technology based on zero-point energy, which is free practically and non-polluting. So, of course, the oil companies, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, does not want this to come out. That's one of the reasons why we haven't heard publicly about it. Also, some of the extraterrestrials are not wanting their presence to be known. And anyway, for a variety of reasons, we haven't learned about this. But all of these technologies we need to know. It will save the world from the ecological disasters that we are facing if this technology is just made public knowledge and is utilized widely on our planet. Okay, let's see if we have any other. Ahmad Omar says, yes, I believe in ETs too. Thank you. I believe in ETs. I have met them myself. Syed Imran Hamdani Advocate says, sir, what's your opinion about the inner Earth civilizations? Actually, the extraterrestrial that I've had the most contact with when I was 9 years old was the first time I met her. And again, when I was about 45, I met her. And at that time, I learned that she actually lives underneath the surface of our Earth. So she was, you could call, from an inner Earth civilization. But she was not a human being. There are many human beings, or very much like human beings who are living inside the Earth, who actually are genetically very closely related to us. You can practically say they are human beings. But I call her my spiritual mother. She was not a human being. She had come from some other star system. But she said for a long, long time her people have been living here underneath the North Pole, actually, she said, underneath the surface of the Earth. So there are a number of different inner Earth civilizations. Some of them are actually human civilizations, people who were living on the surface of the Earth formerly, and in the long, distant past moved underneath the surface of the Earth, perhaps because there was some catastrophe or calamity on the surface, and they've lived there now for thousands or even millions of years. There are some who are very good, very advanced. Some are very spiritual, and others are not. They are more like human beings that is, they have some more selfish motives. But there are a variety of different inner Earth civilizations. The Earth is not hollow, as some theorists have suggested. It's not like a totally hollowed out sphere. But there are huge underground caverns, and as I understand, even oceans or large lakes, seas, and huge civilizations living underneath the earth. Ahmed Omar says, if one of the ETs reveal itself and shows a miracle or its technology and claims he or she is God, then what should we do? How can we protect our faith? Well, in fact, some groups of ETs have, for many thousands of years, shown miracles, and but they generally did not claim they were God. They did appear as angels to people. Most human beings have understood extraterrestrials, the very powerful extraterrestrials, to be some sort of angels. Of course, there are a variety of different types of angels also. But so how should we protect our faith? Well, we should not be worried about protecting our faith. We should trust in God. God will protect us if we are sincere, so we don't need to worry about that. What we do need to worry about is getting deceived by selfish or evil ETs, and there are those groups also. And some of them have claimed to be some sort of God or gods, and they have deceived many people. In fact, there's a group who we would properly call satanic. It may even be that there may be different beings who are claiming to be something like Satan. Of course, they say that Satan or Lucifer is a good person, and that has been something we need to protect ourselves from, definitely. There are very powerful ETs who have tremendous technology and can perform something like miracles, what appear to us to be miracles, and they have deceived people into thinking they are to be worshipped. That has happened a lot in the past. So it's a very, very good question. But what should we do? We can just call on God, the protection of God. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. We pray for the protection of God to save us from the evil, rejected Satan and extraterrestrials of that breed, satanic, selfish extraterrestrials who simply are trying to take advantage of and exploit humanity. But I have no doubt that if we pray, we call on the name of God for protection, God will certainly protect us. God hears our prayers. Sami Allahu liman hamid. Allah certainly hears our prayers for protection. And if we praise God, God will certainly reciprocate with us and protect us. We don't need to worry about evil extraterrestrials if we just take shelter of God, specifically the name of God. If we constantly call on the names of God, then we will receive protection, even from very powerful extraterrestrials who are able to perform miracles to deceive people. And they do have, even human beings now have these technologies they've gotten from ETs, so they can create holograms that appear very, very real, three-dimensional holograms that appear solid. American military has actually used that technology in its wars, like in Iraq. They used holographic technology to make the enemy think there was a huge number of troops that weren't really there. So even human beings, what to speak of extraterrestrials, have such technologies that appear miraculous, or it is, from our point of view, miraculous. Just like our radio and television would have appeared miraculous a few hundred years ago to somebody. So it's just advanced scientific technology. But we can see through these illusions, literally. We can see through such holographic technology if we pray and meditate and gain spiritual insight through the mercy of God and the prophets of God and the saints of God. All right, I think that's enough for today. This is quite astonishing information, but you will see how we're moving in the direction of talking more about extraterrestrial spirituality, and gradually we will go into that in great detail in this class as we continue. So thank you all very much for your excellent questions and for taking all this time to listen, and we will continue this next Sunday at the same time, 8 o'clock here in California in the morning, 8 p.m. in Pakistan. And also the Urdu class at 8 o'clock on Saturday. We will continue that next week too, inshallah. So thank you all very much. May God protect us all.